Fight! You win! Fight! You win! Fight! You win! Fight! You win. Fight. You win. Fight. You win. Fight. You win. Fight. Fight. You win.
Have legalized same-sex marriage since the Netherlands became the first to do so in 2001. And although South Africa was one of the first countries in the world to follow suit in 2006, there is still a lack of knowledge of what it means to be queer in our country and globally. Raising awareness and educating society on a deeper level about the LGBTQ plus community and how people can use this knowledge to be more supportive members of the LGBTQ plus community, supportive allies, and to prevent discrimination are a few of the goals we wish to achieve through this webinar, which will explore LGBTQ law, ethics, and education in society. Simran will now introduce you to our first speaker.
Our first speaker is Richard van Rensburg. Richard holds a Master of Arts degree in Social and Psychological Research. His thesis was on the retrospective narratives of university students reflecting on their sexually diverse identities while in high school, with a focus on space and belonging. His research interests include narrative constructions of sexual diversity, identity development of sexually diverse youth, and the construction of sexual identities in talk. He has co-authored a published article titled Identity in Interaction: Subcultural Intersubjectivities in Popular Radio Conversation on Ixepa. Richard is going to be focusing particularly on the sphere of education. Thank you, Richard.
Good evening to you all. Thank you to the Wits Bioethics Students Society as well as Activate and RainbowUCT for holding this very important webinar on a topic that's very close to my heart. And of course, happy Pride Month to you all, to everyone who's watching. As was introduced in that lovely introduction, I'll be focusing on education, specifically on high schools, as well as on higher education and how this intersects with LGBTQ plus identities beyond the binary. So as was already said, my master's study was retrospective in nature. The reason for this was because I couldn't get access to high school students, which I'll discuss a bit more later. Before I get into the main part of my presentation, just a quick note on terminology. I'm going to be using the term sexual and gender diverse as opposed to LGBTQ plus or queer. Basically, it's going to refer to the same group of people. I just prefer the term because it feels a bit more representative and less exclusionary, but after the presentations, if anyone wants to discuss why I chose that, we can do that. Just as a trigger warning, I think it's fair to provide a trigger warning before I start. Issues such as sexual assault will be discussed, not in great depth, just as I will be mentioning it, as well as discrimination against sexually diverse and gender diverse people. So I thought I would just put that disclaimer out there. So to begin with, in school specifically, I'm going to focus on high school. Some of these issues can overlap into primary school, but the emphasis is going to definitely be on high school. So as we all know, South Africa, and was already introduced in the introduction, South Africa has one of the most progressive constitutions in the world that protects people based on sex, gender, age, amongst other different identity markers. But the unfortunate thing is that the Constitution runs a lot more ahead of what's happening on the ground in reality for most South African people. The Constitution is, I think, a mandate that is very aspirational in nature, and society is still catching up. But hopefully there is still progress where we are catching up slowly and slowly. Okay, so then to dive into the schooling context specifically. So currently learners within high schools in South Africa are still discriminated against, and research shows this. An important factor of South African education, and this is true for a lot of countries around the world, is that compulsory heterosexuality constructs the schooling space and is what informs the experience of learners within that space. So this is basically a term that's used to show that all staff and all learners are assumed to be heterosexual, and this then constructs the experience. So it constructs things such as the schooling space. So you have your separate bathrooms that's subscribed to the gender binary, male, female. You have school uniforms, which are divided very clearly into the gender binary and not much in between. Textbooks as well represent only heterosexual issues, if they represent sexual issues at all, because that's another big factor within schools, is that learners are asexualized, as if they don't have a sexual facet to their identities, which is of course absurd. And there's also like little discussion or no discussion at all even of sexual or gender diversity within schools, which is problematic, of course, because these people, as we know, exist in the real world. Also, to give more context, an NGO called Out LGBT, which is based in Pretoria, released a survey in 2016 on this topic, where they found that 56% of participants aged between 16 and 24 had experienced some type of discrimination against them for being sexually or gender diverse within their schools. And this ranged from verbal abuse to more extremes of abuse, such as physical abuse, as well as sexual abuse. And there's also this finding in the research that fellow students who identify as heterosexual and are clearly homophobic view their sexually diverse and gender diverse peers as being contagious in some way. This comes up quite often in the research. And they also employ discourses around religion and tradition to justify being homophobic or transphobic. I think there does need to be like a huge push towards an intersectional understanding of discrimination within sexually diverse and gender diverse communities. the experience of a white gay male is going to be vastly different to the experience of a black lesbian woman, right? And there needs to be a very keen awareness of the intersections of identity and how that informs discrimination and how it's experienced by these people. In terms of teachers and principals within schools, obviously these are the two groups of people that hold quite a bit of power within the schools and seen as authority figures. And research shows that they are also still discriminating against sexually diverse and gender diverse learners. Again, religion is used to justify this, as well as saying things like homosexuality is un-African, which we clearly know is actually false. And again, this idea of it being contagious and teachers not even wanting to associate with learners who identify as gay, for example, because they feel that maybe another teacher would then implicate them as being part of that community, which is just completely absurd and just perpetuates that stigma. In terms of parents, parents are a very important group because they have quite a big stake within schools. I suppose justifiably so, because it's their children who are attending the schools. And they have power within school governing bodies specifically, which hold power over the school in terms of what gets passed within the school, what's allowed within the school, how certain issues are dealt with within the school, and disciplinary actions. So parents are able to block any kind of gender or sexual diversity that comes along within the school. So any kind of progressive change within the school can be blocked, which is quite sad. I do want to add a note of caution here. Quite an important note is that although the experience of these young people's lives, and I have just painted it as quite negative, which is part of the story, that there is a lot of discrimination and they are victim to a lot of abuse within schools. But this is one side of the story. It's very important to also find ways to show how these young lives aren't just helpless and they aren't just doomed, you know, that there is an aspect of hopefulness and there are ways that these young lives are able to forge out spaces for themselves within school where they can feel a sense of belonging or where they can feel represented, where they can resist homophobia in their own kinds of ways, right? And it's an important thing for researchers and for advocates of the sexually diverse and gender diverse community to keep this in mind, is that there is a balance. And this is all about representation. We don't want to have young kids having the idea that if I identify this way, it's all doom and gloom, that there is hope, which is extremely important in my view. Studies have also shown that there is a movement within schools where learners are becoming a bit more nuanced in their understanding of sexuality, and they are becoming more aware of how the in-out binary of the closet of being openly LGBT or not is a bit more complex than just in-out, that there's different kinds of, it sits on a spectrum. And that spectrum is important for negotiating and managing how you go about your sexuality and your gender identity in particular spaces where you feel more safe or less safe, and how you're able to navigate that. And I think there's also, from my own research, there's a tendency, I think, towards students starting to become more accepting of these kinds of people in the world. But this does lag behind the teachers and the principals who aren't as accepting, which is where the progress still needs to be made, I think, as well as the learners, of course. Then I just want to discuss quickly, this gives a good context, my experiences doing my master's research project. I initially wanted to focus on school learners. So I wanted to access schools directly. But in order to do this, you have to go through various red tape, such as principals, ethics committees, etc., as well as parents. So my study was approved by the Wits Ethics Committee, as well as the Gauteng Department of Education. So it was cleared. It was an ethical study. And I only wanted to access out learners. I wasn't there to out anyone. So it was learners who are already openly identified as sexually or gender diverse within their schools. And I tried to access about 13 schools in total over the course of 2018, so very recent. And I was rejected by all the schools, which was quite difficult on a personal level, because what does this say about how principals view these young lives that exist within their schools. Often the principals didn't give any justification as to why they turned down the study, which I think is telling as well. And what broke my heart the most was that even principals who identified as openly gay themselves rejected the study, which was to me shocking, because you would think they would understand these issues more than anyone else. So what might this say about how principals view these young lives? Is this about protecting them? Is this about protecting the parents? Is this about worrying about that a researcher coming in might find out something, even though research studies such as this are protected and I wouldn't protected by confidentiality agreements? I couldn't tell anyone, even if I found out anything that was shocking. So it gives a good context as schools currently. So what are the kind of solutions that we can offer to these problems? It's good to provide the solutions as well, alongside what's actually happening. So in America, you have gay-straight alliances, which are basically groups where young learners can go and socialize with people like themselves. And there's straight learners as well who join these societies and can discuss general issues, identity. It's a form of bonding. And research has shown that this has improved learners' self-esteem, their academic performance, decreased victimization, and increased their feelings of acceptance and belonging. So this is perhaps a model that can be used in South Africa. To my knowledge, there are currently no schools in South Africa that have LGBT specifically LGBT activities or groups focusing on these learners in specific. There's one exception that I do know of. It is a private all-girls school and quite upper-class school, but that's still progressive. They have an LGBTI society within their school run by the students, and it's overseen by the school counselor. So these are interesting ways that I think other schools could consider taking up for their sexually diverse and gender diverse learners. I think there's also definitely has to be a more inclusive curriculum that includes sexual diversity and gender diversity on its own terms, not as like an add-on to heterosexuality. There has been some progress in this field. The Western Cape Department of Education has released drafts for public comment to modify the curriculum to include issues of diversity, which is a very progressive move. I think it has already gone through the process of public commentary, and hopefully that gets taken up and the curriculum does get modified to include these issues. And then the ultimate goal, of course, would be that this gets implemented nationwide so that all learners can learn about diversity. I think principals are a key factor as well. They need to utilize their positions of power in order to have conversations with parent bodies so that parents can actually allow these issues to be discussed in school. And they're very important issues. And it's not just around, I think it goes into issues of sexuality in general as well. Even for heterosexual discussions, there's this idea of keeping learners asexual, that they're not sexual beings, and that issues of sex are for the home and not for the schooling space. But of course, we know this is completely false, that issues of sexuality come into the classroom space, and young learners in high school have started to go through puberty and even pass through puberty and experience sexual urges, have sexual lives. So these issues do need to be discussed and can't be ignored completely. And my own research, and this is quite an obvious point, my own research has shown that supportive teachers are extremely important towards the identity development of sexually diverse and gender diverse learners. So not all teachers are horrible, right? There are a lot of teachers out there who are supportive of these learners, and that's a very beneficial factor for these students. As I've said, we can't treat these learners as asexual, and giving them a sense of agency over themselves is also very helpful. We also can't disservice heterosexual students, right? Because these students are one day going to go out into the real world and have gay colleagues, have lesbian colleagues, have transgender colleagues. they need to be prepared to deal with difference in the world. And I think that's an important part as well. And these learners, even if their schools aren't supportive, are going to anyway find ways to queer their space. But that doesn't mean we can't still make progress within the field to create schools that are much more safer for everyone, not just for LGBT learners, but for students of color, for students who are disabled, etc., for everyone who is different. And I think that's what this comes down to. But without a collective effort, these individual acts of resistance that learners display will not create meaningful change. There needs to be a systemic change as well. But I think changes are slowly happening, so there is hope there. In terms of higher education spaces, the situation is much the same, where discrimination still exists and is still rife in some cases. I do think there is an idea in some cases, I certainly held it at one stage, that higher education institutions are progressive spaces. Spaces such as Wits and UCT, you have an idea that these spaces are perhaps progressive and liberal, but it's not always the case, and discrimination still happens, unfortunately. University residences, according to research, have been shown to be quite heterosexual spaces as well, particularly difficult for male students who identify sexually or gender diverse because of that compulsory heterosexual culture as well. And it can be very, very alienating. A few years back, as an example of discrimination, the Wits Pride Wall, so there's a wall at Wits that's painted the rainbow flag around this time each year in support of Pride Week and of Pride Month. That wall was defaced with homophobic slurs. That's kind of like a lesser example, because that didn't target a specific human being, but it targeted a group. Still not right at all. Corrective rape, assault, physical assault, verbal assault also have happened at Wits and have happened at other universities such as UCT. There's been lecturers at other universities. I think at NWU, there was a lecturer who said that homosexuality is disgusting in front of a whole lecture hall. So these issues are still happening. And there's still like kind of displays amongst other students of homophobia in lecture halls or tutorial spaces. So again, what can be done to help this? At Wits, at least, Wits has been quite at the forefront of this issue, and they started the safe zones at Wits, which trained lecturers in these issues of sexual and gender diversity to provide safe spaces for students, and students can also get trained as part of the safe zones at Wits, which is a good move, and I hope that other universities take up as well. The continued work of LGBTQ plus societies such as Activate at Wits and RainbowUCT are very important as well to keep up the momentum and push for transformation within universities. And these groups function as well as support groups, such as being part of webinars like this. And these groups can also be advocacy groups to actually keep the agenda moving within the university. So it functions as like a social support structure where you can find solidarity, as well as something that can be more transformative as well. Higher education, like I did mention in the beginning, needs to reflect on intersectionality and see how intersectional experiences inform discrimination within these spaces. I do think lecturers need to go through sensitization training, ideally, as well as admin staff. Channels definitely need to be set up to report discrimination, and in ways that are confidential and that students have confidence that it's confidential, so that they can report these issues. As well as, again, like in schools, you want the curricula to have some element of representation for sexual diversity and gender diversity. And university is quite a good space to have that. And not just in humanities degrees where it is commonplace, I think, or it's a lot easier, but in different degrees as well, such as in the medical degree, to sensitize students towards that one day you'll have patients who identify as sexually diverse or gender diverse. And in engineering, even, that you're going to one day work with colleagues who identify as different to yourself. So I think that's essential in all degrees. Gender neutral bathrooms is also progress that has been made at Wits. I'm not sure about other universities. I think that major universities have started to take up gender neutral bathrooms. This needs to carry on as well. So these are some of the things that are going on and that I think need to keep happening, and things that do need to be implemented as well if they aren't. But still a lot of work needs to be done. But I am one of those people who's quite hopeful about the future. So in closing, I do want to take this one step further in terms of education, and take education outside of the formal education space, and say that education still needs to happen within different spheres of society, such as within families and friend groups. This is where allies are extremely important as well, to advocate for sexually diverse and gender diverse people, which is where webinars like this are so essentially important. Areas such as police departments, health services, governmental representation, these are all services that sexually diverse and gender diverse people use within society. So there does need to be a sensitization and awareness of these issues. So as a final word on this topic, and on a hopeful note, I want to end with a quote by Terry Eagleton, who is a Marxist scholar, and he wrote a book called Hope Without Optimism, and it's all about this idea of hope. The mere act of being able to imagine an alternative future may distance and relativize the present, loosening the grip upon us to the point where the future in question becomes more feasible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. I think we all can take a lot from here in what can be done and what needs to continue taking place in different education systems, and especially in the different spheres of life. Can we have the slide up? Moving now on to our second speaker, Professor Kevin Behrens. Professor Behrens is an associate professor and director of the Steve Biko Center for Bioethics, University of the Witwatersrand. His research interests lie in the areas of bioethics and environmental ethics. He is widely published in both national and international journals and holds an NRF rating as an established researcher. He serves on the Research Ethics Committee of the CSIR and is a consultant on the COVID-19 Critical Ethics Committee of the Lenmed Hospital Group. Professor Behrens is going to be addressing the ethical and legal implications of the LGBTQ+ community in society. Over to you, Professor.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen because I have a presentation. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. I can't get my presentation to show. Sorry, perhaps you should go on to the next person and I'll try and work out what's going on here.
All right. We'll be moving on to our third speaker, and then we'll come back to Professor Behrens. Our third speaker, or second speaker actually, is Kgotatso Kganja. Kgotatso is a film and television student at AFDA, aspiring to write, direct, edit, and produce thought-provoking pieces that reflect consciousness and queerness through exploring both the gender and sexuality spectrum. Inspired by philosophy, science, art, religion, fashion, and music, she is also interested and would like to branch out into other mediums of art, such as poetry, photography, fashion, modeling, as well as acting if given the opportunity to do so. Kgotatso will be speaking about her personal experience and journey, understanding and dissecting the different layers of attraction and how they contribute to one's sexual orientation and gender identity, as well as education on queerness. Thank you, Kgotatso. You can speak.
Hi, everyone. I was just trying to figure out how to turn on my camera. So I'm gonna start talking about like my journey of self-discovery that I took around the end of 2016, where I decided to figure out where it is within the spectrum I lie. As up until that point, I never had the courage to address my sexual orientation, although I was aware that I had an attraction toward men that I wanted to understand and explore. Unfortunately, at the time, there wasn't anyone that I knew that I could safely figure things out with, so I ended up doing research to better understand my attraction. And that research led me to understanding the different layers of attraction that we experience, which are emotional, intellectual, aesthetic, romantic, sexual, and sensual. And based off of that, I wanted to understand how that's reflected in my own life based on the people that I was attracted to at the time, and had been attracted to in my lifetime. At that point in time, I liked a guy, a friend of mine, and I had an emotional and romantic attraction toward him that wasn't necessarily sexual, which perplexed me and led me to do further research on what it really meant to be like gay, straight, or even bisexual, as one sexual orientation is usually defined based off of one's sexual attraction towards an individual and not necessarily the other forms of attractions that we experience. And because of that, I was a bit confused because for the most part, I was more predominantly like romantically or emotionally attracted to people than I was sexually attracted to people. And because of that, it led to further confusion in terms of where it is within the spectrum I lied. So based off of that, I read more on asexuality. And from that, I gathered that there is a spectrum of asexuality that I think I may lie on. Because when I do experience a sexual attraction, I'm not always able to fully express that or articulate that towards those who I felt sexual attraction to. Then around 2017, I had like a spiritual like awakening kind of moment, which led me to question my gender identity. as I felt that I didn't really identify or see myself as a man nor a woman, but somewhere in between. So at the time, I resonated with more gender fluid identities that kind of like fluctuated and flowed between different identities within the gender spectrum. And then it was around last year, June, where I finally came to the understanding of my gender identity, that I'm a woman, and a lot of the confusion and frustration that I had been experiencing over the past like few years since trying to like understand where it is within the spectrum I lie, subsided. Although it took a while for things to like fully make sense. And because I had done a lot of research myself in terms of trying to figure out where it is within the spectrum I lied. It caused a lot of confusion for myself because there were a lot of different identities that I resonated with along the way, such as like scoliosexual or demisexual even, and then like other gender fluid identities like Christed gender and stuff that I thought I could be, but didn't necessarily fit who I perceive myself to be. I feel as though the lack of like guidance from someone else caused a lot of confusion and frustration along the way. Because even though I understood a lot of the terminology, it took a while for me to kind of like process and fully understand my experience and relating information towards myself. Which is why I believe that like in terms of educating queer people educating the public on like queer issues and queer topics should focus, as Richard said, should be focused not only on the youth, but also like teachers, law enforcement, government officials, healthcare practitioners, teachers and parents, so that a safe space for queer people can be created to navigate and explore their identities, so that we don't really have to experience much difficulty trying to understand where it is within the spectrum we do lie. I also feel as though because I'm a relatively privileged individual, it made it a bit easier for me to come to terms and understand where it is within the spectrum I lie, because I had access to a lot to the internet and resources like that to like find articles, watch TED Talks, watch documentaries and movies to educate myself on these issues. But I feel as though people who are in a less privileged position than I am would find it a bit more difficult to figure out where it is within the spectrum that they do lie. For the most part, that's all I have to say. But for like anyone, I feel, who is questioning their identity and still trying to figure out where it is they lie within the spectrum, I think that for the most part, you should be patient with yourself and kind to yourself with regards to finding out what it is you are or could potentially may be, because who you are right now isn't necessarily who you may be like in a few months from now, or let's say 10 years from now. Because at the beginning of my journey, I thought I would be either gay or bisexual man, whereas now I've come to realize that I'm not even a man, and based off of like the way in which society has conditioned us to perceive gender in a binary sense of life, it can cause a sense of confusion for oneself to conform to this or that. But you shouldn't allow yourself to limit the idea of who you could potentially be because that could limit you from figuring out who you truly are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your personal journey with us. It was very enlightening. Professor Behrens, you can take over now.
Thanks. Can you hear me? So I think I've managed to get it to work now. Let's have a look. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Great. Okay. So last Friday night, I did normal Friday night things with my family, and we watched a movie that had just become available on Netflix called The Boys in the Band. And it was originally an off-Broadway play. It was written in 1968, just a few months before the Stonewall riots. And one of the first things that occurred to me when we watched this film was just how much things have changed since it was written. There can be no doubt that there has been significant progress, at least in some parts of the world, when it comes to the rights and the freedoms of LGBTQI+ persons. But even in a country like ours, in which there are constitutional and legal protections, the struggle for rights and for acceptance continues. Most of the progress, I think, that has been made to date has been with regard to gay, lesbian, and bisexual rights. I think we've got a long way further still to go when it comes to the well-being of transgender and intersex persons. So I want to respond to the theme for this seminar, Beyond the Binary, by directly addressing some of the false beliefs that I think people hold about gender and biological sex and sexual orientation. So I'm going to start, I guess, by considering some of the facts, and I'm going to start by looking at some cases. This is Emmy and Caleb Smith. They are, would you believe it, identical twins. They were both born male in terms of biological sex, but by the age of around 12, Emmy realized that she did not identify as a boy, and at 17 she came out as transgender, and she had gender confirmation surgery. This is Carlos. He is now 12 in this picture, but the photo that he is holding on his chest is a picture of himself a few years earlier when he was a girl. He is one of a small number of children in the Dominican Republic who suffer from an enzyme deficiency that causes them to be born with genitalia that look female, but when they reach puberty, they experience a surge of testosterone, and that causes them to develop male genitals and to grow into adulthood as men. This is Cheryl Chase. She was born with ambiguous or atypical genitalia, and at first it was decided to raise her as a boy, but around about 18 months of age, they did some exploratory surgery, and they discovered that Brian, as he was called at the time, had a uterus, and he also had gonads that were both ovarian as well as testicular. So then they decided that she needed to be raised as a girl, and they performed surgery. They removed what looked like a large clitoris or a small penis, and the parents threw away basically all photographs of Brian, as he was called at the time, changed his name, and they moved to a whole new town. They kept the truth from Cheryl until she was over 12 years old, and she has suffered her whole life from physical effects of the surgery that was performed on her, including the complete inability to be able to experience any kind of sexual sensation whatsoever. So she's now a campaigner for not performing surgery on intersex children until they're able to choose for themselves and to give consent. This is Danila Kovalev, a model who is known for a very androgynous look. Androgynous people are people who have both conventionally masculine and feminine characteristics, and they usually reject traditional gender roles, behaviors, and mannerisms. Some will dress and use makeup to deliberately accentuate their gender non-conformance. So just to try to make sense of some of all we have seen so far, we need to talk about a number of different concepts. One is the notion of what biological sex actually is. Biological sex exists on a spectrum, and it looks at genitals, chromosomes, gonads, hormones. All of these play a role, and most humans fit into either the male or female category at the either end of the spectrum, but about 1 in 100 fall somewhere in between. And so at one side we might talk about female, and the other end we might talk about male, and in between we may talk about intersex, who are people who may have any kind of combination of chromosomes and ovarian tissues, genitals, and other sexual characteristics. In fact, there are literally scores of variations of sexual characteristics. Gender identity is far more related to how people think about themselves. Those who are experts in the field say that it's often actually established already by the age of 3. But this is a deeply felt sense of either being a man or a woman, or a gender that is both, or possibly fluid, or neither. And here we usually talk about a spectrum from being a woman on the one end to being a man on the other, and somewhere in the middle, non-binary or fluid, and of course the spectrum of all types in between. Gender expression, on the other hand, is the way in which people express themselves, and that has got to do with the way in which they dress, behave, the way in which they possibly speak, and other outward signs. And so we often talk about gender expression as existing on a continuum from feminine on the one end to masculine on the other, and we would talk about androgynous persons somewhere in the middle. Sexual orientation, of course, is not particularly related to anything around gender, but it has to do with an individual's physical, romantic, or emotional attraction to members either of the same sex or of the opposite sex, or of both sexes. And so we usually, again, talk about orientation also on a spectrum from lesbian or gay on the one end to heterosexual on the other, with bisexual persons in the middle. So in summary, what this slide represents is what is normal, what is natural in humanity. If we are human beings, our gender identity exists on a continuum, our biological sex exists on a continuum, our gender expression exists on a continuum, as does our sexual orientation. So all of these things fly in the face of a way of thinking that is binary and exclusionary. And that kind of thinking does this. It basically leads us to a situation in which it limits the experience of humanity. It objectively is wrong in its conception of what is normal and natural, because it tries to exclude whole parts of what being human is all about. So these beliefs are wrong, but they have significant consequences in terms of the way in which people behave and the attitudes that they have. And these kinds of wrong beliefs harm LGBTQI people, and I think they harm society in general. Some of the ethical challenges then that arise as a result of these kinds of wrong beliefs, these binary and exclusionary beliefs about what it means to be human in terms of our sexuality, our gender, and our relationships. For the whole LGBTQI community, it involves shaming and humiliation, ostracization, rejection by family and friends, condemnation by cultural, social, and religious groups, prejudice in the workplace, the failure to recognize relationship statuses, poor representation of people's lived experience in the media and arts, a deep fear often of public displays of affection related to the possibility of violence, hate crimes and murder, prejudicial treatment by civil servants, depression and mental health issues, and an increased risk of suicide and self-harming. For the transgender group of people, there is also concerns about access to safe public toilet facilities, about ignorance from doctors and social services and the public, about being misgendered, lack of respect for preferences with regard to names and pronouns, struggling to change legal sexual status, despite the fact that we actually do have laws in this country which allow people to do this, extreme prejudice when it comes to disrespect and refusal to be served by public officials, all kinds of barriers to medical treatment, including obviously important sex reassignment surgery. There's an incredibly long waiting list for people wanting this kind of surgery in this country, and very few institutions that in fact perform it. Shaming and disrespect from healthcare professionals, and a lack of focused social and psychological services for these people. For intersex people, they experience most of what transgender people experience, but in addition to that, they also have to deal with a conspiracy of silence, which has almost made them invisible in our community broadly. It is something people just do not want to talk about, the reality that there are in fact many people who are born who cannot be biologically described as either male or female. There's almost no representation in media and in the arts. There's pervasive ignorance about their reality. There is non-reversible surgeries that are done on infants without their consent to try to supposedly normalize them. And then there are the psychological as well as the physical harms that result from those treatments through life. Most people who are intersex will talk about how they have been deceived, how they have been lied to throughout their lives, and they also speak about the objectivization that they often experience when they have to go for repeated medical consults throughout their lives, and their bodies are objectified by the science and medical communities. So how should we respond to all of this? Well, in the first place, I think that we do need to focus on transforming policies and practices. Despite the fact that we have a constitution and we have laws that in many ways are quite supportive, legislative reform is still needed. I think that is especially true with respect to transgender and intersex persons. A lot more needs to be done also to prevent violence and crime against persons in this community. And in addition to that, and possibly even more important than that, is the need for us to find ways of ensuring that the existing rights and entitlements that are already guaranteed in our law are actually respected. Having good laws is not good enough on its own, and we need to find other ways in which we can prevent unfair prejudice and injustice. There are far too many of us who have experienced disrespect, shaming, obstructionist behavior, even a refusal to provide services at the hands of civil servants, other officials, businesses, organizations, and even ordinary members of the public. I think a second and even more fundamental thing that we need to do is to confront the challenge of wrong beliefs. What people believe is not necessarily benign. Beliefs can, and they often do, cause harm. Respecting the rights to freedom of conscience and belief does not require us to be silent in the face of false and harmful beliefs. When some say that they love the sinner, but they hate the sin, or when they say that the only kind of love and sex that is beautiful and good is between people of the opposite sex, or when they say that the purpose of all sex must be for procreation, or when they insist that our love is an illness or an aberration, we need to confront them about the hurt that their words cause, about the psychological harms, the suicides, the self-harming, and the other consequences that result from their judgment and from their lack of acceptance. When they say that girls should be girls and wear dresses and play with dolls, or that a man who dresses as a woman is mentally ill, or that intersex infants must undergo surgery to make them look normal or fit in, or when they say that it's sick for someone to be attracted to and to love both men and women, we need to tell them that they are objectively, factually, and scientifically wrong, and that they should learn to value and to celebrate all of the amazing varieties of human gender, sex, and love. And when they say that their God or their prophet or their holy book or community leader or elder teaches them that we are aberrant and unnatural, we need to kindly suggest that they need to shop around for better spiritual and moral authorities, ones who will respect the wonder of the rich diversity of human life in all of its amazing variations, and those who do not teach exclusion and hatred. We need to confront harmful false beliefs, and we need to make sure that there's no place for bigotry and hatred and ignorance. And finally, and probably most importantly, we who are LGBTQI+, we need to learn to practice being proud of who we are and loving ourselves. We need to get this right before there's much hope for us to change society. The movie that I mentioned earlier, The Boys in the Band, is particularly hard to watch. It shows a group of gay friends struggling with their lives and their sexuality in a far more oppressive context than ours. And while they're not in denial about who they are, it's clear that many of them still struggle to fully accept themselves. In a repressed society that would reject them if they were open or out, they have seemingly internalized some of the denigration and hatred of the community. Their pain and their frustration bubbles over, and they lash out at each other, probably because there's no one else that they can lash out at. Towards the end of the movie, one of the main characters says, if we could just learn not to hate ourselves so much. Steve Biko, in Confronting Racism and Apartheid, wrote that the most potent weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. He spoke about how, as a result of 300 years of deliberate oppression, denigration, and derision, blacks are suffering from what he called an inferiority complex. He claimed that the oppressed had internalized the view of themselves as inferior that the oppressor had invented and foisted on them, and that there could be no chance of becoming free from oppression until the oppressed rejected that false view of themselves. He wrote that the first step, therefore, is to make the black man come to himself, to pump back life into his empty shell, and to infuse him with pride and dignity. I think something similar is often at play in the way in which LGBTQI persons perceive themselves. Even in a time in which there is acceptance, or more legal protection, few of us have escaped the rejection of family or friends, condemnation of religious or cultural groups, and even threats, humiliation, ostracization, and violence. Some struggle to free themselves from a pervasive sense of guilt or of shame, however openly and even defiantly they might live their lives. It takes work to overcome internalized self-hatred, but it is the key to true liberation. So first of all, we need to be practicing to be proud of who we are and loving ourselves. This world truly is a better place because we are queer and we are here. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers for all this informative content and practical ways on how we can educate ourselves and be better allies to the community. So now we're going to move on to the question segment of this webinar. And the first question we have is, what can doctors and medical professionals do to help? I'm a medical student and an ally, but I feel like I'm not doing much. So any of our panelists can take this. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that question. What can doctors and medical professionals do to help? I'm a medical student and an ally, but I feel like I'm not doing much. Maybe our panelists can comment on this.
I'll comment on this briefly. I want to preface my response with that obviously I'm not a doctor, I'm not in the medical field, but from a humanities perspective, my background's in psychology, although I'm not a practicing psychologist. I have degrees in psychology. So I think in terms of medical students, I think it's important within lecture spaces to be aware of what your lecturers are teaching you. Hopefully the lecturers are imparting some kind of knowledge about LGBTQ individuals as well, alongside heterosexual issues. For example, like when you're talking about hormones, that you can bring in stuff about intersex individuals or trans individuals who are going through therapies to confirm their gender, so that these issues are brought into the lecture space. And on like a human level, I think that just being open towards diversity and difference, and having conversations with fellow students who identify as LGBTQ+, being open to those conversations, being open to learning and going on your own and researching about these issues to inform yourself, being open to learning making an effort to learn what people's pronouns are. I think that's something big for doctors as well, as being open to learning what your patient's pronouns are and keep it on file, and make that space a bit safer. Obviously, you don't want your doctor to be discriminatory. And in the cases where doctors feel uncomfortable treating someone, which, shouldn't happen, because the oath is that you're going to help everyone who comes into your practice. But if they feel uncomfortable, that instead of making the experience horrid for the person, that they just refer them on to someone who they know is accepting of those issues. But the hope is that the doctors will be affirming. So I think my biggest advice there is to be affirming and accepting of these different identities and be open to learning about them. And I think the power of personal narrative, like Khotatso shared with us, that power of personal narrative is very important. So having conversations with people who identify as LGBTQ+ and hearing from their personal experience helps to inform us about difference in the world.
Definitely, thank you for that. I would just like to add, for anyone that is interested in learning more about gender affirming healthcare, please do look into Gender Dynamics, because they're hosting this super informative and helpful workshop with practical skills on how to be a better ally and a medical professional in general. So moving on to our next question, I think this is specifically for Prof. Behrens, and it asks, how can we turn the subjective reality of an individual's gender orientation into a law? So as an example, perhaps you could consider the issue of gender pronouns and freedom of speech. Please, Prof. Behrens, do comment.
Sure, thanks. Could you repeat the first part of the question?
asks, how can we turn the subjective reality of an individual's gender orientation into a law?
Okay, so I guess what you're getting at is that people have their own subjective experience, their lived experience, and I guess we don't want to necessarily turn that into a law, but we want to find some ways in which our laws can recognize and affirm that subjective experience of their gender identity. Yeah, and I guess that's a pretty hard question to answer. I mean, to some extent, South Africa does already have some kind of legal provision that I suppose does recognize that, in as much as there's the act about registration of your official gender, which allows people to change and to change, their official registration with the Department of Home Affairs, and in fact, quite amazingly, acknowledges intersex people, for instance, as a gender group or as well. So I mean, I guess it's quite progressive in that sense. But I think that we've still got quite a long way to go, and I guess that's what I'm trying to get to in what I've been saying, is that we've made quite a lot of progress when it comes to sexual orientation, but I don't think we've made as much progress at all when it comes to people who are transgender or to dealing with intersex persons. And possibly one of the things that is necessary is for us to look at ways in which we can address this in terms of legislation. But I must admit that I'm only myself beginning to think about this, and I don't really have much by way of an answer, to be honest.
Thank you for that. I see that this area still requires a bit of work. So the next question asks, in an ethical context, do you think it's wrong for someone to disapprove of the LGBTQ plus community on the basis of their cultural beliefs? Regarding a cultural relativism debate.
So I suppose you're addressing that to me as the sister around here. Yeah. So cultural relativism, of course, is complex. So on the one hand, we want to acknowledge as much as possible the fact that culture and belonging to a culture or to a group has a lot of social goods associated with it. And the idea of being able to identify with and belong to a group is something that is important. And we don't want to take that away from people. And our Constitution, in fact, recognizes and affirms the fact that people have a right to cultural practice and to being engaged in their culture, etc. Our Constitution, however, does limit that, and it's very clear about the fact that that is limited, and our right to practice our culture or to participate in our culture is limited in terms of other rights. So if it's somehow or the other causes harm or infringes on the rights of other people in other ways, then that right is limited even in our Constitution. So yes, I think it is important for us to recognize that culture is very important to people, and especially in our context when we went through a situation in which through the whole imperialist era, people their cultures in Africa were denigrated by the colonialists. And so we want to encourage in every way that we can that people should be able to affirm their own cultural background and live it as much as possible. But that does not mean that there aren't things that we know objectively are bad for people. And I think it's very easy for us, for instance, to say, well, whatever your cultural belief might be, actually, it is really, really harmful for young girls, for instance, to be subjected to female genital mutilation. We know that that's harmful, and that's good enough reason for us to say that that's something that shouldn't be acceptable, no matter what someone's culture says. And we know that not accepting or affirming people who are LGBTI is just as much harmful to them. And I think it's not just harmful to them, I actually think it's harmful to society broadly, because it kind of excludes us from the benefits of being able to interact with people who are an important part of our community. So as much as I'm committed to trying to affirm people's culture and their rights to culture as much as possible, I think if it is objectively obvious that a cultural practice or a cultural belief or a religious belief, for that matter, causes people to treat others in ways that are harmful and objectively not good for them, then I think we have to reject them irrespective of their cultural background.
Great, thank you so much for that. That was very informative. So perhaps you guys would like to comment on. So someone asked, it would be interesting to hear the panelists' take on a safe space or center dedicated to queer youth to gain knowledge, support, and safety.
I'll respond to this one quickly. So one of the things that was frustrating for me in my master's research, so my first option was to go to schools and access learners directly through schools. But then the other route was to get the same age group of students is to go through an organization that targets youth specifically. The problem, and this makes me so upset and so angry, is that there aren't any, that I know of, there aren't any youth-focused queer groups within South Africa. At least to my knowledge, I couldn't find any. If they are, they have been like either very, very, very small ones that are trying to like just start off, so they're not really established, or there's ones that kind of start from 18 and above. There's nothing for youth specifically. That's specifically for queer youth, which is the big problem, and it's very much needed. And hopefully there's someone out there who advocates for this and actually brings about some kind of youth center, or even if it's like some kind of informal youth movement. Ideally, and this is what I was trying to address in my presentation to some degree, was that schools can function as the space where these issues can be addressed and targeted, but given like practicality, maybe the schooling space sometimes can be too broad and too alienating, and maybe even if there is these things within schools, the queer youth might not actually want to go to them because of fear of being outed or victimized, etc. So it is a complex thing. It would be lovely if there could be a queer group. I think it would improve. It gives role models, right, to young people, like in Hotatso's presentation, that if there was a kind of role model or someone to speak to that could have helped in one's identity development, right? It gives you a space where you can talk to people who are like-minded, who understand the experience, who understand the issue. But unfortunately, it doesn't exist at the moment. So my hope, my idealistic hope, is that something does emerge within the coming years, specifically targeted to youth, and that it can be upscaled to across the country.
Thank you for that. On this point of inclusion and education and support, there are a few questions regarding non-binary education. So do you think that the inclusion in the South African curriculum is a possibility? How do you think that this inclusion will be made possible? and how far away is South Africa from implementing this inclusion?
I'll jump in there again for this one. I'll be brief though. So I think it's definitely, it is going to come about eventually, I think, at least. I'm hopeful. I'm sure you've picked up on the theme throughout. I'm a hopeful person about these things. But as I said, the Western Cape Department of Education has released a draft for commentary, for public commentary about including issues of sexual diversity, at least. Maybe far-reaching, like deeper understandings of sexuality and gender identity might be a bit too much of a reach, like including like these deep issues that we've gone through about intersex and transgender issues. Maybe that's a bit too aspirational at the moment. It would be nice just to start off with some kind of representation of sexual diversity and gender diversity within schools. What this would look like, I think just including like the kind of issues that we've discussed in this presentation that Prof. Behrens brought up, maybe not as in much detail, but like to some extent, because you are dealing with school learners, of course, and how far away this would be, because there's already movement and advocacy for it, I think. And the thing with South Africa and policy and implementation of policy and curriculum in particular, it takes several years for this to get implemented, but I'm hopeful within the next 10 years that there will be some kind of formal representation.
Yeah, I might add something there. I think, you know, one of the issues we deal with in this country is that this kind of disconnect between what seems to be an almost sycophantic allegiance to the Constitution, so that you find many people who will say, oh yes, well we need to you know, accept people because the Constitution says so, and the Constitution says that we may not discriminate on these grounds. But there's this disconnect between that kind of like almost official commitment to doing what the Constitution says and what people personally believe in themselves. And so, you know, we found, for instance, that there's a huge problem with our laws about terminations of pregnancy. So despite the fact that everybody out there will go around saying, yeah, well, the law says it's okay, there's still all sorts of people who encounter all kinds of obstruction when they go to try and have a termination of pregnancy. And that is because the nurse or the doctor or whoever it is, despite officially saying that they're supportive of the Constitution, actually has a problem, maybe because of their religious beliefs or whatever it might be, with people having abortions. And I think we have the same kind of problem when it comes to this sort of situation, and that if we were to allow, or we were to ask for teachers to start taking on teaching some kind of sensitivity training or whatever around LGBTI issues, the fact of the matter is that we're struggling already to get teachers who are supposed to be teaching life orientation or whatever it is to deal with things such as contraception because they have personal objections to it. So possibly I'm a little less positive than Richard, a little less optimistic about the future. And I think that the fight is going to be a lot harder because we have a very, very conservative base of people in this country whose values and beliefs actually are not in line with our Constitution. And as much as they pay lip service to it, in reality, when it comes down to their actual beliefs about what is right and what is wrong, they are extremely conservative. And I think that there's quite a lot of work to be done.
That was really enlightening, seeing how we require change, fundamental change on an individual level. So our next question, specifically for Cortazzo, so this asks, how does one incorporate conversation about inclusion with individuals who are close-minded?
It's quite tricky, because sometimes you can have a conversation with someone who isn't necessarily interested in listening to what you have to say, versus you can have a conversation with someone who's closed-minded about an issue, but I guess is willing to hear your points of view on what it is you think on the situation or subject matter. And I think the difficulty comes in where it's distinguishing who's interested in listening to what you have to say, versus who's not. Because, and this is now from my personal experience, I've been in situations where I've tried to educate people who have been unwilling to listen to what I've had to say, and I've ended up just wasting my time. But there are also people who have a different point of view and are trying to open their minds to seeing a different point of view, where it takes time for them to hear what you have to say and stuff like that. So it's very much situationally dependent, from person to person, based on who's actually interested in what you have to say. And there's also times where people just want to waste your time, just to like derail you and almost like frazzle you and frustrate you by talking about what it is you trying to open them up to hearing. Yeah, that's my personal experience on like how to navigate those situations. It is very tough, trying to figure out who is actually willing to listen to you and who isn't. But yeah, trial and error, I guess, is the best way to go about it.
Thank you so much for that. Would any of our other panelists care to add? Okay, so if that's it for that question, there's another question here that's a little personal, but it could possibly help someone that's confused. And it asks, has moving out of your family home helped you express your sexuality more, or is it the same? Anybody could comment on that.
For me personally, I only moved out of my house this year and went to university this year. And I guess it's given me more like freedom of expression, because I don't necessarily feel as though I need to like, not necessarily hide parts of myself, but in terms of being vulnerable, giving myself the space to be vulnerable, to like explore and experiment with things, in terms of like self-expression and stuff like that. Although my parents are aware of my sexual orientation and gender identity, I think moving out of their space has given me the freedom to allow myself to express myself more freely and openly, because being in their house, I wasn't necessarily always able to allow myself to be vulnerable, in terms of figuring out how to express myself in certain ways and stuff. But yeah.
Would any of our other panelists like to add? Okay, so again, I think that this has brought us to the end of our question and answer segment. Thank you so much, Kukatsu, for that wonderful final answer. So the Wits Students Bioethics Society would like to offer thanks to our wonderful speakers, Richard van Rensburg, Prof. Kevin Behrens, and Kukatsu Ranger, for taking the time to enlighten us on this topic and participate in this important conversation. Thank you to everyone who joined and tuned in on YouTube for attending our event. We hope that you have enjoyed learning about the LGBTQ+ community and have found these discussions to be enlightening, and that they help you to be better members of the community, better allies, and more understanding of the complexity of the issues at hand. Finally, we would like to extend our gratitude to Activate Wits and RainbowUCT for collaborating with us. These collaborations not only serve as wonderful opportunities for South Africa's university societies to interact, but allow for the creation of a network that reaches across the country, creating even greater awareness for the issues we wish to tackle. So this brings us to the end of our event. Thank you. Have a good weekend. Stay safe. If you guys have any further questions or require assistance, please feel free to message the Bioethics Society. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you to everyone who attended the event.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks a lot.